This is chapter 3, part 3. Let's switch over from talking about things like the brain and brain functioning and neurotransmitters, and let's talk about the issue of insanity and its connection to serial murder. Um, Now, first of all, we all need to make sure we're on the same page that insanity in the criminal justice system is a legal, not a psychiatric distinction. Insanity would be determined by a judge or by a jury, um, not by an expert, not by a psychiatric expert or a medical sort of expert. It's actually a jury might hear from experts who would give their expert opinion on whether the defendant was mentally ill at the time they committed the crime or not. So definitely juries will listen to experts, but at the end of the day, they're the ones that decide whether, um, say, for example, a defendant is found not guilty because of insanity, due to insanity. That's the jury, the legal system decides that. So we need to know that right off the bat. Not mass murderers, or I should say most mass murderers, unlike serial killers, have a history of mental illness. Now, I would qualify that a little bit because when you hear mental illness, you may think we're talking about people who are hearing voices, seeing things that aren't there, who act very disconnected with reality, act what we think of when we use the term like quote unquote crazy, right? The person doesn't make any sense. Their behavior is erratic and irrational. We're not talking generally about that kind of mental illness. Uh, when we say that most mass murderers have mental illness problems, we're talking much more likely to be talking about depression, mood disorders. There could be suicidal. A lot of times, their mass murders are sort of a big grand exit, big grand suicide where they kill themselves at the end, but they take a whole bunch of people with them before they go. So in that sense, they're mentally ill, being suicidal, depressed. Occasionally, they'll have this psychosis, which means being disconnected with reality, hearing voices, seeing things that aren't there, that kind of thing. But that's the exception. That's the exception. It's not the rule by far. With most mass murderers are not psychotic like that, and neither are serial killers. Serial killers are usually a small percentage of them will have mental illness in the sense of being disconnected with reality and all of that, the psychosis. Uh, but serial killers generally, like mass murderers, do not have those kind of symptoms. And serial killers are, you know, uh, not well. Some of them will have mood disorders like the depression, like the this suicidal type stuff. But no, not most of the time. These guys are sort of fairly good, high functioning individuals who seem normal on the outside, who don't seem like they're mentally ill, but whose behaviors reveal a great deep disturbance. But so you could say that they're mentally ill in that sense. That what sort of person would want to, you know, not only kill multiple individuals who might be strangers that you have no beef with, no connection to, but kill them in very horrible ways using torture, mutilation, or even cannibalism, things like that we'll talk about this semester. That just seems on its face to be crazy, to be mentally ill. And certainly in a way, it is in a way. But when they're talking about mental illness, they have certain diagnoses, which are uh, listed as mental illnesses. And the one that the serial killers have that's a official sort of diagnosis that they very often have is like antisocial personality disorder, or psychopathy, being psychopaths, where they lack a conscience. They see people as objects to be exploited and used. They're callous, they're unfeeling, they're manipulative. They play with people, toy with people, and use them for their own selfish desires, disturbed desires, that kind of thing. So they're psychopaths. Many of them are psychopaths and or antisocial personality disorder, which is very much the same sort of thing. But quote unquote crazy, like we think of when we talk about mental illness, no, that's not what they're um, problem is typically the most serious, the most likely diagnosis of mass murders to prior to the killing, when they kill people, is paranoid schizophrenia and/or depression. And now this is taken from Hickey, the textbook. Um, but between these two, depression is much more common than schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, yes, you do see uh, some mass killers who are disconnected from reality, who are hearing voices, who are seeing things that aren't there, who that's what we mean by schizophrenia, who maybe talk nonsense and that kind of stuff. Yes, you do see them, but it's not a large percentage of mass killers, and it's not a large percentage of serial killers either. It's not common. Depression, though, for mass murders is common, very common uh, occurrence among mass murderers. So Hickey, I think the author of the textbook, is a little misleading in making it sound like these two things might be similar in how common they are. Not so. Depression much more common. They're also likely to have a history of child trauma and violence, but most have never been institutionalized. So we do see, this isn't 100%, but you do commonly see a history of child abuse among these serial killers, whether we're talking about physical child abuse, which is probably the most common, but also could be emotional abuse, which is also common. And then common but less common would be sexual sorts of child abuse. But the trauma from that has been linked to violence later on. And we see with violence in general, not just serial killers, but violence in general, that if you're someone who's had a history of child abuse as a child, that you're at greater risk of growing up and being violent yourself or being abusive to others than people who were not abused as children. There's a correlation, it's just a correlation, but there's a correlation there. Most legal jurisdictions ensure that not guilty by reason of insanity, or NGRI, offenders are automatically placed in psychiatric facilities regardless of the current state of mind. So that's one thing to also know, this basics about the criminal justice system and mental illness, is that if you are deemed by the courts to be not guilty by, you've committed a crime, it's clear that you committed it, but you're found to be not guilty by reason of insanity, it's not that you are found, um, that you're found not guilty and sent home. They just send you to a psychiatric hospital where you're locked up in a psychiatric hospital instead of a prison. And you'll stay in that psychiatric hospital where you will be locked up. It's secure. It has locks on the doors and that kind of thing. Not as secure as a prison, but it's secure. It's not easy to escape. And that you'll be there until deemed that you no longer are suffering from that mental illness and you no longer pose a threat to the community, to other people, to yourself, if you have suicidal or self-harming tendencies, that kind of thing. So again, don't make the mistake of thinking that if you're found not guilty by reason of insanity, you just go home and you're free back into open society. No, typically, at least if you're committing a serious offense, if you're guilty in the sense that you did commit some serious crime, you're probably going to go to a psychiatric hospital and be institutionalized there. They can only be released from that psychiatric hospital when clinically deemed to no longer be ill and no longer be a threat to the self or society. So that's the standard, is we keep you locked up in a psychiatric facility until experts deem that you're no longer a threat to other people or to yourself. As long as you're seen as being a threat to yourself or others, then you stay institutionalized, and they keep giving you therapy and working on you, hopefully bringing you back to full mental health. Less than 1% of cases, of criminal cases, so you're charged with a crime, a serious crime, even a felony, serious crime, violent crime, for example, only 1% of those cases use the insanity defense. So the lawyers only claim this person's not guilty because they were mentally ill and they committed the crime. They only try that strategy 1 out of 100 times. It's rare that they even try it. And when they use it, it usually doesn't work. It works like maybe 25% of the time. When so it's used rarely. So tried only 1 out of 100 in 1 out of 100 cases. And then if you do try it, most of the time it doesn't work. Maybe 25% of the cases it works. Most serial killers do not use this defense because juries are not going to buy, generally speaking, that this person was mentally ill if you're a serial killer. If you have, in a cold-blooded, calculated way over the span of several years, killed a number of people, most juries are not going to say, okay, this person's not guilty because they're mentally ill, or they're mentally ill at least when they committed the crimes. And if some expert says, well, they're mentally ill because they're psychopaths or they have antisocial personality disorder, the jury's going to say, we don't care. We don't consider that to be mentally ill. The killer knew what he was doing. He didn't have to do it. He knows right from wrong, so therefore he's guilty. That's what typically happens if it's a serial killer who's on trial. The only sort of people who are more likely to be found not guilty by reason of insanity is if it's someone who has where you can show a brain scan and you can show that their brain is not right. So someone who has a brain tumor that causes them to act violently, or other sorts of brain damage that seems very tangible and very, if someone is extremely psychotic, hearing voices, Satan is telling them that they need to kill their children or something like that. That's a case where the jury might be convinced, possibly, that that the person is not guilty by reason of insanity. But usually the jury has to be convinced that the killer didn't even understand that what he was doing was wrong. And most of the time, criminals, even if they have psychiatric issues, they usually behave in a way where they know what they're doing is bad. They try to hide the evidence. They try to escape. And so they show, at least in their behavior, that they know that it was bad. And as long as you know that it was bad, a jury is usually going to say, well, you knew right from wrong, so you're guilty. So that's the way that tends to work. The M'Naughton rule is a legal rule that you see with respect to the insanity defense. And according to this rule, to establish insanity, it must be proved that at the time of the criminal act, so when the crime, let's say it's a homicide, when the homicide occurred, the defendant did not know what he or she was doing, did not understand it was wrong. That's a pretty strict standard because, as we just said, most of the time criminals act in a way where they realize that it's bad what they're doing. They try to run away. They try to hide the crime, the evidence. They lie about it. They try to avoid detection. Well, those are all signs that you know it was bad. And the M'Naughton rule says you're only not guilty by reason of insanity if you don't even know it's wrong. So someone who would fit this rule would be someone who killed, if we're focusing on homicide, kills the victim and then, doesn't even try to hide it, doesn't try to get away from the scene, does something like, I don't know, just makes no effort to hide or deny their crime because they don't think it was bad. They're so deluded, they're so mentally ill, they think what they did was somehow a good thing. God was telling them to do it, or so, they're doing something good, that kind of thing. So it's a strict standard, and that's why most of the time it doesn't work to try to use this as a defense. Juries are not going to buy it. The Bronner rule or substantial capacity test, it's a different kind of rule about mental illness. A person is not responsible for a criminal act if, because of mental disease, he or she did not appreciate the wrongfulness of it at the time or lack the capacity to obey the law. See, so that last phrase there adds a little twist, something extra. That not only that you didn't realize it was right, it was wrong what you were doing, the first part of it, the wrongfulness of the crime, or even if you knew it was wrong, but you couldn't help yourself. See, that lacked the capacity to obey the law. So, if you claim that you had a mental illness that forced you to commit the crime, compelled you to commit the crime, even though that you knew it was wrong, you couldn't help yourself because of mental disease. That's the Bronner rule or substantial capacity test. And most states, the trend across the country, across the United States for the past few decades has been to not follow this rule if you couldn't help yourself, if you were felt compelled to do it and you were out of control because of your mental illness, that will say that you were not guilty, even though that you knew it was bad. No, that most uh, jurisdictions around the country, most states around the country, don't go for that. They don't buy that. They don't follow that. This idea that you were forced to commit the crime, you were out of control, you couldn't help yourself. So that's an idea that's out there, but it has become not a sort of popular way of looking at what it means to be not guilty by reason of insanity. The Durham rule: the accused is not guilty if the behavior was the product of a mental disease or defect. So this sounds like that Bronner rule with the mental disease or defect thing. This definition has fallen out of favor since juries must rely too much on the opinion of the psychiatrist. So when you're focusing on, does the person have a mental disease or defect or disorder, and that's what the focus of the rule is, then the idea is there, well, we need to have a doctor to tell us whether there's a mental disease or defect there. The doctor's the expert, knows more than we do as a jury. So again, that this definition is not popular, like the Bronner definition is not popular. What juries around the country tend to be instructed to do is to decide whether the criminal knew what they were doing was bad or not. If they knew it was bad, if there's signs that they knew it was criminal, that it was a bad thing, then they are guilty if they did it. That's a stricter kind of rule that juries tend to follow around the country nowadays. So, big picture here, big picture is that the criminal justice system does not like to decide that people are not guilty by reason of insanity. They have a very high standard for that. Incompetency: defendants cannot be tried unless found to be capable of understanding the proceedings. Those found incompetent are typically placed in a mental institution until found competent. Few serial killers are incompetent. So this usually isn't relevant. So if you get somebody who's mentally ill, let's say psychotic, schizophrenic, when they're arrested and brought in, and they don't even understand what the charges are against them, they don't understand they're in trouble, they don't understand what's going on. This incompetency rule says, well, you can't try somebody in that state because they won't know what's going on. They won't understand what's happening to them. So you have to wait until they're healthy again before you can try them. Process them through the criminal justice system. So you just hold on to them, you put them in a mental institution until they hopefully become sane again. But this is not usually the case with serial killers. They aren't like that. They understand that what is going on. They understand their crimes. They understand the criminal justice system. And so they are competent. And so that's the typical serial killer is quote unquote rational in that sense. They get it in that sense. So it's back to what I said before, that few of these serial killers are psychotic. Okay, let's stop there. We'll continue on later.